This podcast is for teachers and educators that want to better understand what racial equity is, get strategies on how to create a culturally responsive learning environment, and learn how racial equity improves outcomes for students, particularly students of color.
Welcome to the podcast from the Diversity, Equity, and Poverty Resource Teachers of JCPS. Our theme this month is Are You Making Space for Race? Creating places for students to talk about race through curricula and lessons. I'm Rachel Klein, Equity and Inclusion Resource Teacher for the middle schools, and I'm here with my lovely team today.
Good morning, I'm Katia Turner, Zone 1 Resource Teacher, Elementary.
Good morning, I'm Lamanda Moore Rodriguez. I am Equity and Inclusion Resource Teacher for Zone 3.
Hello, I'm Shashray McCormack, Zone 2.
Good morning, Kenita Ballard, AIS Elementary Schools.
Donna Lawson, High Schools.
Thank you, ladies. So today, like I said, we are chatting about creating space for our students to be able to talk about race through curriculum and lessons. It is that time of year when we are stressed out, we are drained, we are flat out exhausted. And we should be. The demands of teaching are exhausting, and we've been running since August. But so have our kids. So how have they been spending their energy in your classroom? Are they exhausted too? Are they being challenged and pushed each day in the right ways? Or are they tired of being frustrated by lessons that don't engage them, that don't allow them the freedom to discuss their racial identities? Are they frustrated that they don't have enough opportunities to contextualize their experiences within a diverse curriculum? Let's slow that down and unpack it a little bit, beginning with discussing racial identities. For people of color, understanding and embracing one's identity in a society dominated by pervasive whiteness is a complex process, and it often occurs in steps. Leading theorist on ethnic identity development, William Cross Jr. describes the process in 5 phases or stages. First, the first stage is called pre-encounter, and this is a time in a person of color's life when they are absorbing implicit and sometimes not so implicit messages about the dominant culture, which in turn sends messages about their culture. This is also a time when they are not aware of the implications of these messages. Following pre-encounter comes encounter. At this stage, a moment or an event forces a person of color to realize that they are a member of a group that is the target of racism and bias. After that stage is immersion or emersion, and those who make it to this stage have begun to surround themselves with imagery and literature and music that reflects their racial identity while simultaneously avoiding symbols of whiteness. They seek out support and community with those who are of the same racial backgrounds. Stage 4, internalization. At this stage, people of color have become proud of their identity. They're looking for relationships with white people who are willing to acknowledge and respect their identity and self-definition. Finally, at stage 5, we have internalization and commitment. People of color at this stage have become advocates for the concerns of other people of color, and they're comfortable with their own race and those around them. I want you to think about when I said at stage 3 that those who make it to this stage enter it. Ladies, why do you think that there are some folks out there who don't even get to this point?
So I think a lot of it has to do with where you grow up and how it's talked about in your family or how it's not talked about in your family. The message of the dominant culture are around us everywhere, in our media, at schools. And so sometimes it's really easy, or it feels easier for people of color to just go along to get along.
And so I agree with Katia. So I'm thinking about these stages for people of color and Black people. And so I think maybe sometimes we may not make it to that immersion stage just for fear of what's going to happen next. You know, I understand that I'm different because it's been made apparent to me. I know I've had negative experiences because I'm perceived as different. So it could be to where some people of color and Black people may not even want to, further blend into the culture because they have that fear of more exposure from that pre-encounter and that encounter stage. So it could just be where, we have a lot of white people these days who are living in that colorblind world. It may be that I am going to live my life colorblindly because I don't want to be seen as different so that I'm treated in a different way. And so I still feel like white people also live in this world of just, I want to be colorblind, or it could be totally the opposite. I've had, the pre-encounter and the encounter stage, and now I'm going to immerse myself in the culture, and I'm going to be radical, and I'm going to be proud, and I'm going to, sing our praises, because I see that being different isn't a negative. It should be a positive.
I agree with both Katia and LaManda, and I think sometimes because in so many places whiteness is centered, and that because whiteness is centered so much that everyone tends to assimilate because it's easier and less stressful for them. And even in spaces and places where you think that your blackness is appreciated, there's always something that is going to remind you that it's not, because you haven't assimilated enough, right? And I find that a lot in spaces where you have liberal white people who feel as though they are down for the cause, but they tend to burn you out more than just as much as white folks that do not subscribe to being liberal.
And to all these really good points, there are barriers to being able to immerse yourself in one's culture. I mean, we only have to look at what the dominant culture says about pride. Dominant culture conflates pride and separatism, and it oftentimes discourages people from being able to, one, create spaces for themselves and protect those spaces. We see this oftentimes within the reaction to pride parades is often, well, why isn't there straight parades? The reaction to creating spaces, like on our very own district, of a school that is dedicated for girls of color and the most marginalized, other marginalized, the reaction is, well, then why isn't there a school for white girls to be able to be scientists, et cetera, et cetera? And again, that's because there's just a lot of unclear messages that are being directed at people of color about them being able to celebrate and immerse themselves in their culture.
So I appreciate your commentary, ladies, and as we move forward, I think it's critical that we also discuss what racial identity development looks like for white people as well. So American research psychologist Janet E. Helms describes these stages, and similar to the racial identity development model for people of color, there are also points along this progression that may or may not be reached depending on the individual's experiences. So first, in the white racial identity development model, we have contact, and people in this stage are adhering to that colorblindness that LaManda referred to earlier. They're believing that when we talk about racial differences, that actually lends to a continuation of racism and racist beliefs rather than actually sitting and talking and understanding differences. They don't consciously hold firm to racist beliefs, but they could be there simmering underneath the surface. At stage 2, there is disintegration, and this stage occurs if the individual has had an experience that confronts their prior concept of the world. This leads to a deep emotional response, perhaps in the form of shame or guilt. As these emotions persist, they might either push that person positively to disrupt their biases, or in a negative sense that might dominate their consciousness. And if this occurs, then the next stage might occur, and that is called reintegration. If an individual's emotional responses to their challenged worldview leads them to this stage, they are likely to blame the victim or feel as if their white privilege is earned, and they might begin to feel like they are in fact superior to minority groups. Moving into the next stage is Pseudo Independence. If after disintegration and reintegration occurs, then a white person continues to confront their worldview, they might move into this pseudo-independence stage. And it's at this point that they turn to people of color to help them understand racism and bias better. And this tends to comfort the white person as they feel like they're working toward becoming non-racist. If they do move past this stage, there is a point of immersion and immersion for white people as well. And they are becoming aware of their white identity, and they're looking at ways to positively interact with both that identity and their identity as being anti-racist. They're seeking other white people who are grappling with that as well, and they're looking for how movement toward the future in a positive way can occur. And then finally, the sixth stage is autonomy. These are white people who are clear in their racial identity, they have positive feelings about it, and they are actively pursuing social justice. So, as with the previous model, I want to send this back your direction for a few minutes, ladies. Why do you think that there are some white people who are being held back from getting past any stage beyond disintegration, or why might they be stuck in a lower gear?
Sometimes I think, Rachel, that it's an ignorance of history, or not having an understanding of white privilege, and then very quickly taking offense to it without even really understanding what it is or the ramifications of it. Often it's not surrounding themselves with people of color so that they understand a different perspective other than their own. I think there's also a lot of fear of saying the wrong thing, or not knowing what to do or how to behave or what to say. And then kind of when you have this realization, being unsure what you need to do with it next, and not knowing which direction to go in that. Sometimes I think it's liking the status quo and not wanting it to change, because there's a great deal of comfort there, that the default culture is white and there's a normalcy for a white person in that, and reliability, so that they know how to behave and the expectations. And when that's not the case, there's uncertainty, and that's uncomfortable.
I think earlier when we discussed the color blindness of, sometimes how that is how white people react, and that's still kind of where we are now. So I feel like in the very first initial stage, in that contact stage, there's no explicit demonstration of racism. There's nothing that a person is showing to say that they are racist, which is why that color blindness is so scary. But what we fail to realize is that this can also cover our unconscious racist beliefs, our implicit biases that lie beneath the surface. They may not be coming out, but they are definitely still there.
I think, even as we think about the term colorblind, who created that term? Right? Where did that come from? So that in itself is problematic, but because I feel like it's a term used to make white people feel comfortable to not have to have the conversation about race. And I think that when we think about white families that tend to silence their kids when they point to someone that looks different, or have conversations about how someone else looks different, they silence their children. However, black mothers and fathers are having to have conversations truly about complexion and being black, and how black kids have to maneuver in society. And I think that when white kids are silenced, that parents are basically saying, no worries, you're white, you're good, right? So we don't need to have this conversation. And that spills over generationally, along with the historical factors of things, and that our universities are putting out teachers, as we think about our pre-service teachers, with that same mentality, because they're not challenging them in their thoughts. So it all still, I think, goes back to assimilation, and as soon as a black person has something to say or speak out, especially being a woman, I could be the angry black woman, or everything has to be about race. guess what? Everything is.
And if that spills over into the classroom, depending on who's in front of those students, if they have that colorblind point of view, then that is yet another group of kids who is being forced into silence to not be able to talk about difference and to recognize it and have discussions about it.
So we've had discussions before about the structure of racism. And so I think for both people of color and for white people, because our country was founded on racism, that it's invisible to us. And so some of the things that social scientists have noticed about our failure to act regarding racial bias and bigotry is that it's invisible in modern form. And these can be trivial incidents that seem harmless and are often dismissed. And so no one's really sure who's responsible for that. And it just gets left to the side. Or people are afraid of retaliation. What are other people going to say?
I think it's the visible invisible. It's very well visible, right? But it's the visible invisible, meaning people want it to be invisible, even though it's smack there in your face. And I think a lot of times people want to ignore because they don't want to have the conversations because it's uncomfortable. And that makes me go back to that Donna, when she spoke about some teachers or white people are scared of what they might say if it's wrong. But what are one of the things we've been taught? You fall, you get back up. You ask questions, no question's a dumb question. Or if being scared of saying the wrong thing, I often ask, because I think it's twofold. Why are you scared? Because evidently there is something there that you're thinking about that may be wrong, right? And or say it. And if it is an issue, say it to someone you feel like you can, have the conversation with, and they'll let you know. Ask me.
And if you're not willing to take the risk because you're afraid of saying something wrong, then no matter what, it's going to be wrong because you're in taking that risk and potentially saying something right, then you've missed out on an opportunity to create a community in your classroom and to give kids those tools to speak with confidence and clarity. So in taking that risk, if you've set up your community the right way, then your kids will gently but firmly call you on it. Yeah. And we have to stop being afraid of being called on something when we're wrong as teachers, because if our kids love us the way that we love them, it will end up positive for all people involved. Any other comments, ladies?
So Daryl Wing Sue defines racial microaggression as everyday slights, insults, put-downs, invalidations, and offensive behaviors that people of color experience in daily interactions with generally well-intentioned white Americans who may be unaware that they've engaged in racially demeaning ways towards target groups. And microaggression is really one of the ways that the structure of racism is upheld. And so when we look at educational institutions and we think about ways that we are marginalizing our students, our curriculum, our structures, our policies, we have to think about how we can act and how we can respond in ways that honor our students. And one of the things that Sue talks about as a micro-intervention strategy is making the invisible visible. And so these are skills that we want to not only model for our students, but also equip them with so that they're able to speak up for themselves, to challenge the dominant narrative about who they are, and to have their voices heard.
All right. So looking at these development models for racial identity, there are additional researchers on this topic. specifically John and Joy Hoffman, and they believe that there's a stage that precedes pre-encounter and contact for both people of color and white people, and they call it conformity. And this is where both groups believe that they're, quote, just regular Americans. Unconsciously, members of both of these groups are striving to emulate whiteness in actions, speech, dress, beliefs, and attitudes because whiteness is perceived as positive, and that ties directly back to the systems that have upheld racism as long as they have. So I'm going to go on a tangent here for a minute, and anybody who's listening and knows me is probably going to laugh to themselves because I'm going to talk about gardening, and that's just something that I have a passion about. So as soon as spring rolls around and the sun begins to thaw the earth, I have my hands in the soil. And through trial and error, I've come to realize that in some instances, the soil isn't the right pH for some plants. And in some instances, some plants love full sun and others wither in a matter of hours with the sun beating down on them. Some want lots of water, some are content to be forgotten for days. Some suffer and choke under the oppressive growth of weeds. And like plants, we develop or sprout under conditions outside our control in our formative years. And as our leaves unfurl and we begin to absorb what is around us, we unconsciously take in what our surroundings give us. And what we take in becomes deeply rooted in our perspectives, our identities, and our experiences. And sometimes I recognize that there's a plant that's growing that I need to transplant because it's not doing well in its current conditions. And these transplanted sproutlings can either shrivel and die if they're not placed in their optimal conditions, or they go through an adjustment period where they wilt at first, and then once they're given ample sunlight and nutrients, they bounce back and they begin to thrive. And I think this has a lot to do with the phases of racial identity development in the sense that we need surroundings that foster our growth and don't hold us back. So I want to bring us back around to some of my questions from before. How are our students spending their energy in our classrooms? Do students have opportunities to discuss and grow within their racial identities and to contextualize themselves within a diverse curriculum?
So, I mean, if we're being real, we know the answer to this question is no. Our students, for the most part, do not get the opportunity to see themselves, their racial identities, to contextualize themselves within a diverse curriculum because we're not teaching a diverse curriculum. Something that is notable for teachers is that we have teacher efficacy. If we know that our students aren't seeing themselves within the curriculum that we're teaching, one, it's an opportunity for authentic engagement to happen, which is not happening. More and more, we're seeing so many disengaged students in the classroom just sitting and getting and listening. But then also, it is a missed opportunity to connect with students about their lives. If we're not trying to make these connections, if students don't see themselves in the classroom, why should they listen?
Yeah, and I think on that note, something to really dig deep into that question is you asked, do students have opportunities to discuss and grow within their racial identities and to contextualize themselves within a diverse curriculum? There are verbs that we have to put in our sentences in order to make that happen. When we as schools, as teachers, are just buying these prepackaged curriculums or we're giving credence to a lot of these big names in education that speak to things about these are best practices, these are equitable practices, without actually digging into what does that mean, we're not doing the work. We cannot have a curriculum that has the word equity attached to it without understanding what does that mean then for the students within our classroom. We're essentially letting people do the work for us, but even then not really, because there are certain programs and again, prepackaged curriculums that have certain clout around them. But again, we have to be intentional with this work that we are doing. But I also want to speak to that this is something that is essential not only for schools and institutions that have majority brown students. This is not about necessarily white versus black. This is about all of our learners needing to understand what it means to engage and operate within a diverse society. This is about healthy and productive expressions of racial identity. Our learners who are white need to understand, what does that mean in their present reality and in their future realities. Our students who are Latinx need to understand, what does that mean in their present and future realities. We all have to understand, what do our individual identities mean when we're coming together in a collective society.
Right. So you bring up some really important points about what, as teachers, we are poised to do, or what we can do with the expertise that we do have. So I want to bring us back to the R tool. There is a section called Knowledge Construction, and it references contextualizing experiences. And it states that curriculum allows students to position themselves contextually within the content in order to create meaning and to affirm their racial identity. So let's just start with context. Context is that which surrounds a word in a text, or an event, or a circumstance, a statement, or an idea, or a person. What context are we providing for our diverse learners to figure out who they are in relation to their surroundings? How are we designing settings in which students can get the whole picture and not just small pieces of the puzzle? There are people out there who love to do puzzles, and there are those who don't, but either way, there's no greater frustration than looking at a nearly completed puzzle only to find that there's a few missing pieces. Imagine a student's frustration when they're given only parts of the puzzle in their classroom and left with an incomplete understanding. Or worse yet, they realize that they are the missing piece, but no one helps them to find their way into the larger picture. Donna, did you want to interject?
Just that they have no way, sometimes they don't have a way of understanding what the big picture is. I once heard of a story about somebody that stored all of their puzzles in Ziploc bags with no picture on the front. And I can't imagine doing a puzzle like that, but yet that's what we're expecting students to do often, because it's not part of their lived experience. So they don't have a picture, and they don't even know what puzzle they're working.
So that is where a trusting classroom community that is built on positive, intentional relationships fosters opportunities for our students to ask for more, to have the chance to influence choice in books, in topics, in the products that they use to demonstrate their mastery. Now, teachers, back to your exhaustion. Aside from the natural exhaustion that occurs around this time of year, are you doing too much? Are you doing too little? Are you frustrated because these kids don't want to listen, to learn, to engage, to try? Instead of asking why they won't do these things, ask yourself if your curricular materials are encouraging listening and learning and engagement and effort. Ladies, what ideas do you have for incorporating students' identities in instruction, materials, learning settings, and the like?
I think my first step is usually just asking simple questions of my students and of my PLC members. What experience do you have that is similar or different? What background knowledge do you have, or does your family or your community have? And a lot of times we tend to lead discussions as teachers as opposed to students, and that misses a really good opportunity to pull in their identities and their experiences of them and their families and their communities.
And then also here, I think it is important to mention the teaching tolerance, social justice standards, and that is a great way to incorporate our students' identity, but not only their identity, but how they learn about diversity, justice, action. Like, all of these 4 domains are really great for teachers to look at and incorporate into their teaching. And as I'm looking at the social justice standards, even the one, just a section about identity, the very first one says students will develop positive social identities based on their membership in multiple groups in society. Another one, students will recognize that people's multiple identities interact and create unique and complex individuals. So just by learning about the different social justice standards that teaching tolerance has, and even the grade level outcomes that we can translate those two, are really going to help us bridge the gap. But if we don't know that these resources are out there, or if we are just not taking the time to see how those connections can be made, then we're doing a great disservice to our students and ourselves.
I think it's very important as we talk about identity. I know we've talked a lot about the black and white issue, and I'm with Kanita that we all have identity, but it's very important, like LaManda mentioned, that based on our social identity and our membership in those groups. So what do we do? You know, if we bring it back to a lot of times you may hear white people say things like, well, I didn't do that. That was my ancestors. Things are different now, and so on and so forth. But knowing your identity, what have you done to fight against injustices? Like, where has the action taken place? Do you recognize the injustice? Do you recognize the house that racism built, right? So what do you do in that identity? How do you occupy the space within the identity that you identify with, right? So I think, again, that those teaching tolerance standards are absolutely amazing as we dig very deep in our classrooms. And I agree with Rachel again when she talked about, you know, if you have set up a community of comfort where your kids are, you know, willing to have those conversations, that they will be had for sure.
I know that as we discuss all of these ways for incorporating identities into our classroom, you're not alone in the sense that you have to do all of this by yourself. There are some excellent resources out there to jumpstart your thinking around this. So LaManda referenced the social justice standards from Teaching Tolerance, but Teaching Tolerance itself is an amazing digital resource that contains lesson plans and lesson pathways, and another section of that site is called Hard History, and that is an excellent resource for generating conversations around the parts of history we don't often want to discuss. And the best part of all is that it is free, and they love to send you copies of their materials if you put in a request form. They have helped us out many times. There's another resource out there called the 1619 Project. We also have a site called Because of Them We Can. And finally, Embrace Race. So please, 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 if you are wanting to pursue this route, and I strongly encourage that you do, of course, then please check out some of these resources.
I just wanted to say a word to our friends out there who are like, you know, all this stuff is too touchy-feely for me, and are really questioning, what does this have to do with my numbers, my data? There's research out there, and I always recommend Zaretta Hammond, Culturally Responsive Teaching and the Brain. For our students of color who are subjected to racial trauma at very early ages, one of the things that we have to do as teachers to provide that safe classroom environment is to make that space for intellectual safety. And, you know, just going over your classroom rules is not enough for our students of color. We have to let them know that we see them, and that means that we see their community. That means that we see their struggle, and we have to let them know that we believe in them so that they are able to develop that academic mindset and see themselves as learners in our classroom that are willing to engage. And the materials we choose in our classroom, the questions that we ask, are part of helping them do that. And I know I saw a tweet maybe a few weeks ago that just had some very simple questions on an anchor chart. Whose voices are represented? Whose voices are missing? And then why would that be? Those are very simple questions that can apply to any area and open the opportunity for students to discuss what's going on in their community and from their viewpoint.
So I want to bring it back around to exhaustion. Let's end here where we're looking at it in a more positive light. So you and your students should be exhausted, but you should be exhausted together. You should be exhausted from digging deeper, from asking these questions, from learning together, and from the discovery of truth, and from finding those puzzle pieces that are missing. And when those pieces are found, that should be a celebration together. Puzzles take time and they take effort. And the satisfaction of putting a whole puzzle together is amplified when there's a collective effort around its completion, which is exhausting. It's thrilling, it's enlightening, and it's exhausting.
And as always, we invite you all to capture that thrilling, enlightening, exhausting work using the hashtag RUJCPS. That's hashtag AREYOUJCPS.